The Canadian and Western world population trap. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard, as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been looking once again at the impact of population and immigration on the economy, this time focusing in on Canada. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going well. How are you going?
I'm going very well. Now, this was a very interesting article to me today, and I want to get into a few things specifically related to us in Australia a bit later on. But what's going on in Canada, and what did the Bank of Canada recently come out saying?
So, two economists in Canada have recently come out and basically uh, pulled the government apart and said this immigration needs to stop. It's unsustainable, and we're entering into something called a population trap. Now, just to put in context how bad their growth is even compared to ours, so their net immigration last year was around 3.2%. So Australia right now is around 2.6%. So they're significantly higher than Australia. So that last year, October to October, there was 1.25 million immigrants to Canada, and 310,000 of those just arrived in 3 months. And the economists are saying that what is sustainable is 300 to 500,000 people. So they are treble
Yeah, that's
where they
much larger.
yeah, the sustainability just isn't there. And it's just the Canadian economy and Canadian resources are not keeping up with the plethora of people. And you look at Australia and everyone's up in arms at Australian property prices not coming off. Well, Canada is even worse. So yeah, there's some insanity there.
So you mentioned this term, the specific term population trap, and I know you talked about this a bit in the article that there's sort of actual meaning behind that. Can you maybe give us a little bit of background about what you specifically mean by this idea of a population trap?
Yeah, so I hadn't really heard of a population trap before, and it's quite interesting because there's a lot of economists talking about it over the last sort of 10 years, but it actually first came up in about 1798 with this guy called Thomas Malthus, who coined this thing, and he basically said that the trap behind it is you've got population growth, which happens because I'll read it because it's very good. He said there's two laws. The first law is that food is necessary to the existence of man. So that's law number one. And law number two, that passion between the sexes is necessary and will remain nearly in its present state. So basically, people procreate. So that's where it first came from. Now, we know that that probably doesn't apply to Western countries anymore because we all know the birth rate decreasing.
Yep.
But this mass immigration is basically the population growth. So what his initial law was is almost that food growth is linear with technology, or resources become linear with technology. But people then feel richer, or countries feel richer, so they invite more immigrants in, and population can grow exponentially. And that is basically what's happening in Western countries right now. And a population trap occurs when that linear relationship sees productivity and prosperity not keeping up. So people then start dropping in their prosperity because there's the same amount of resources being shared with a lot more people. So it comes back to almost a subsistence level of living.
So that's quite concerning. Where I mean, obviously, it's hard to pick exactly where that threshold or point is where we fall completely into the trap. But you're saying there that it's not just like Canada's the sort of fastest horse in this race at the moment, but it's certainly not an isolated story. We've been hearing about very similar situations unfolding in the US. It's been a big political issue at the moment about border control. Obviously, it was a political issue for a number of years now, but we're also hearing about it here in Australia. And you were talking a little bit about that earlier as well. But can you maybe give us a little bit of more background around how that impacts the US and us here at home?
Well, you say that you can't pick a point where it happens. Well, what's actually interesting with the theory is there's this thing called the Malthus catastrophe. So this is when it gets to the point where it's more subsistence. So the standard of living, I guess, drops because more people are sharing more and more. And it's defined by a moment in time in society where there's war, famine, or disease. So I think we've ticked two of those boxes recently.
So maybe
famine.
it is clearer to identify where we are. Yeah.
And I think that's what, Canada's starting to say. They've pinpointed their housing, their the housing state over there with prices just escalating, people not being able to live where they want to live. And look at Australia and look at America. It's exactly what's going on. You've got last year in Australia, 1 in 36 people made Australia their home. So if 36 people, if you know 360 people, 10 of those people made Australia their home last
That
year.
seems like a massive percentage.
It seems insane. And the US in some ways don't even have a handle of what's going on there.
Yes.
Because, they've got, what they're arguing is an open border. They're trying, Texas and some of these states are trying to close it. The federal government's not letting them. They don't really have a handle on who's going on. I mean, I've heard numbers since Biden's been in charge of anywhere from 10 million, and I think Trump recently came out saying 14 to 16 million. So, in a population of 350 million, it is just out of control.
And I suppose that's one of the benefits that Australia has always had geographically with, being surrounded by water. It's much harder to get in, but our numbers are still large, aren't they?
Yeah, but Canada's the same. I mean, they're surrounded by
Yeah,
water
true.
with America on the border. So, I mean, not quite Australia, but very similar in that this is governments allowing this to happen.
Yeah,
And
that
this
was
is
my thought.
governments.
It's not a natural occurrence. It's a strategic choice made by these
Yeah,
governments.
absolutely. So, whereas the population trap used to work because people felt wealthier, so they started having kids. This
Yep.
is actually a situation where the wealth may or may not be being felt, but the government is forcing it into a population trap where your standard of living is decreasing. Australia's productivity hasn't moved in 10 years. We've spoken about that before.
Yes.
So, and they are, by forcing more people with more finite resources in the economy, they're forcing inflation and they're forcing a reduced standard of living.
So I know we'll often have debate on the topic of exactly who these people are. And I think it's probably a good point to ask the question to you of what really the difference is here between a refugee or a genuine refugee in that environment and an immigrant, potentially legal or otherwise, coming in, and how that sort of fits into this discussion.
Yeah, so again, I'll go back to a conversation I had with someone in LA who is a very smart man, who was talking about, I said, immigration is eventually good for an economy. He said, you need to understand the difference between a refugee and an immigrant. And in Australia, we don't really have refugees as much as we have immigrants. Now, a refugee in his mind was someone that came into the economy, was from a war-torn country or had a poor healthcare system. So I guess he's sort of thinking Central South America, where they're below the poverty line in a lot of places. He said those people come to America and they may never work, they may never learn the language, they're poorly educated. They become a burden to the state. They don't ever add to the economy. So, for one refugee that comes in, you might need two Americans maybe to support them. Whereas an immigrant, and not an illegal immigrant, but an immigrant that is coming to a country to settle, they've got a job or they've got a new business, they are adding to the prosperity of the country because they are, they're working and they're paying for themselves, and perhaps they're more than paying for themselves. So they become that equivalent American that can support a refugee. So you've got one taking resources away and one adding resources. So I called that the difference. And when that was pointed out to me, you sort of really start to understand why Europe and America are really starting to struggle, because they haven't been able to control who comes in. There's a lot of talk about it all being men, not many women coming in.
Mm.
So it's just not going to necessarily add in the future to their economy, because they're not all going and getting jobs that add to prosperity.
I can see. I mean, obviously, it's always a challenging line to decide who you let into the country on humanitarian grounds and all sorts of different things, because it's a very complicated world out there. But at a base level, I can certainly understand the differences that you're pointing out there. That you really, because of this trap you're talking about, you really do have to understand the difference between the people that you're letting in at scale. Because yes, there's always capacity to um, provide refuge for more people, but not when it tips the scale over and we end up in this trap that you were talking about. So
And
I
this,
suppose that leads me to, well, that literally leads me to this last question of, is it too late, like, to avoid this trap? Is there still opportunity to change course? How do you see the path forward?
so I would just like to say my business partner is a refugee and my husband is an immigrant. And, you know, just because someone's a refugee or an immigrant doesn't mean they fall specifically into the category.
Yes.
It's just a generalization. This is an economic theory around population and population movement. And it is what's going on and what you're saying. And with these mass movements that's going on, so is it too late? Well, the Bank of Canada is saying stop. It's
Yes.
too fast. So they're saying it's not too late. But then you look at the actual theory. Well, it's war, it's disease, and it's famine, and we're two down. So maybe we are just hitting those levels, and no one wants to acknowledge where we actually are. I mean, it's not the world, right? That the refugees coming into the Western world are coming from the entire world. So,
Yes.
we already know there's famine in parts of the world. So maybe this is just, pushing the whole problem to the rest of the world.
It's certainly a very interesting topic to be thinking about, and it's one that has a lot of political ramifications. So it's something that we sort of need to be um, really understanding what's going on behind it, so that we don't just get caught up in the shouting matches that occur with politicians when they talk about this stuff. So I think that's really valuable, and really appreciate you taking the time to explain all that today. So thank you for that, Alex.
Oh, it was really interesting. I've never heard of it, and it's a really interesting theory. And I think those two economists nailed it.
Yeah, that absolutely, because you can see how all of that fits together. So, oh yeah, I think that's really valuable. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll chat again soon.